Anything?
Yeah.
All right.
What happened?
I think people have decided the sun is more important than the church this morning. Anyway, welcome. I don't think I need to introduce Richard again, but Andy, you want to make an announcement before we begin, and then we'll turn it over to Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I'm Andy Harris. I'm on the Adult Ed Committee, and we would like to hear from you. And we're doing this by having a survey which is going live this week. You'll receive it, a link to it electronically in the Westminster Weekly, in the Chimes, and various other ways. Please fill it out. We have 8 different categories of talks that we typically do here at Westminster during the Adult Ed Hour. And we would love to know, what are your favorites? What are you most interested in, or just interested, or less interested? So give us feedback. The survey will run for 3 weeks and then it'll close. So vote just once. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Can you stand one more week of this? More. Well, if you were here the other weeks, you'd recognize what's up on the screen there. One of the realities of life is that in the long run, culture wins out. Very clear that the Roman culture Romanized Christianity. Very clear that American culture has Americanized Christianity. It's also true, by the way, that we're not the only ones. If you go to Spain, you will find the Spanish culture has Spanishized. Is that true?
Yes, today it is.
Christianity, it's inevitably true. And it comes and goes in greater dimension, but for better or worse, in the long run, culture tends to win out. It's going to seem today like what we're doing is just one more chapter in the same story. And in many respects it is, though there's a little difference between the culture war over gender in our culture and that in ancient culture. We're going to tease that out a little bit today to try to think about it. There were some very peculiar issues, gender issues in early Christianity that we do not face. And so I want to explain that as we go along. So it's not news to anybody that there are gender conflicts in our culture. Over almost every area of life. And they usually involve choice, responsibility, and opportunity. And I listed a whole lot of ways there. That isn't news to anybody. Of all of the culture wars over gender in our culture, one of the most prominent right now is the issue of abortion and reproductive rights and choice for women. That one operated a little differently in the ancient world than it does today. We'll talk about that in a minute. So it's going to sound a little today like the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because many of the issues really do just continually reappear in human life. Now, it's also, I'm sure, news to no one who knows anything about history at all that the ancient world was patriarchal. So that's not the news for the morning. But we do have to take it into account. Moreover, patriarchy exists in our world today. In some ways, it's a little different, but in many ways, it's just the same story one more time. So, the other thing we need to say is that almost everything that I'm going to share with you today has, through most of Christian history, been repressed. It's simply been hidden, in some cases because no one bothered to ferret it out, but in other cases because there have been active attempts to make sure that nobody knew. I will show you some of that today as well. It's also true that today it exists in the church just as it always has. For example, there are denominations in the U.S. today that will not ordain women. Roman Catholics are the most well-known, but they're by no means the only ones. Southern Baptists will not, Wesleyan Methodists, Missouri Synod Lutherans, and there's a variety of others, in which all leadership is male. That was the rule in the church in which I grew up. In that particular congregation, which still exists, it is still the rule. There are no women leaders in that congregation. So, even though everybody is aware of the fact that patriarchy was the characteristic of life in antiquity, we don't need to beat it to death, but I want to at least show you a couple of items that will indicate the attitudes that were prevalent. Here's an example. The woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed, for the authority has been given by God to man. That's Josephus, a Jewish historian from the 1st century. Pretty clear. Here is another Jewish writer. This was a Jewish scholar who lived in Alexandria during the 1st century, Philo. Women are best suited to the indoor life, which never strays from the house, within which the middle door is the boundary for maidens. What he means by is unmarried women who have no children. And the outer door, those who have reached full womanhood, meaning they're married and have born children. In other words, stay home. Do not leave the house. Now, Philo even gets more specific a little bit later. This one is actually quite shocking to me. Woman should not be a busybody, meddling with matters outside household concerns, should seek a life of seclusion, should not show herself off like a vagrant in the streets before the eyes of other men, except when she has to go to church. Okay? When she has to go to the temple, and even then, she should make plans to go not when the market is full, but when most people have gone home. So that, like any freeborn lady worthy of the name, everything quiet around her, she can make her oblations, offer prayers. So, even if you go to church, don't come when everybody else does. Stay home till everybody else has gone home. Here is one that's going to be interesting in a minute. This is in Plutarch. Plutarch was another 1st century writer, wrote in Greek. There ought to be no random talk about fair and noble women. Their character should be unknown except to their own consorts. Now, I just showed you 3 or 4 quotations like that. I could spend hours today, showing you just quotations with that sentiment in antiquity. It is all over ancient literature, was prevalent and clearly was the attitude in that society. But there were some exceptions. And that's really interesting to me. There were exceptions in a culture which was overwhelmingly patriarchal in its attitude. As we go along here, we'll talk about the fact that women were far more restricted in Greek society than they were in Roman society. And I'll show you why and to what extent and among whom a little bit later. But even in Greek society, where women really were not allowed outside the house, there were exceptions. And one was the Greek city of Sparta. You're familiar with Athens and maybe Sparta and the Athens-Spartan War and so on. But Sparta was an exception. Women had considerable freedom. They definitely had a public role. And I wonder, why is that so? What was different about Sparta than all of the other Greek cities that allowed women a public role in that particular city? We'll talk more about it later, but in order to figure out why that was the case, we got to look at some data. So one of the things that we have to look at is population data. There's very, very interesting research over the last few decades among scholars who are called demographic historians. They study populations and its peculiarities in different locations. So we're going to look at that for a little minute. And one of the things you notice immediately is that men greatly outnumbered women in the Greco-Roman world. Now that was surprising to me when I first encountered that, but the data is clear. Moreover, the population in the first century in the Greco-Roman world was declining. That's interesting. It's declining in the US at the moment. So we have a declining population and far more males than females. At least one Roman author, Dio Cassius, attributed the decline in population to the shortage of females. That accounted in his mind for the low birth rate, and the result was the fact that Romans were not replacing themselves. Their population was actually declining. Now, the demographic historians tell us that there were 131 males to every 100 females in Rome. That's an astonishing bit of data. In Italy and the rest of the Roman world at large, there were 140 males per 100 females. And as the demographers will tell you, that is not possible under natural circumstances. Something is going wrong, somebody's interfering, something is happening, being done by somebody that is reducing the female portion of the population. So what was it? Well, that one ain't so hard to figure out. The exposure of unwanted female infants was rampant in the Roman world. It was morally accepted by all classes of Roman society. Aristotle, I didn't bring it out, but Aristotle has a long discussion of why it is immoral to retain all female babies. I mean, that seems shocking to us. This is a bit of evidence that's just mind-blowing. One demographer has come up with this. In large Roman families, and he's not talking just about the elite, he's talking about families at all levels. They just did a study in Delphi of 600 families that were large families. Only 6 of the 600 families raised more than one girl. So female infanticide was one major factor in the lower number of females in the society. But it gets worse. Before it gets worse, we got to look at this letter. This is a letter from a guy named Hilarion. We don't know who he was. He was a soldier. He was stationed away from home, and he writes a letter back to his wife. He writes, "Know that I'm still in Alexandria. I ask you to take good care of our baby son, and as soon as I receive payment, I'll send it up to you. If you are delivered of a child before I come home, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. You have sent word, don't forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you not to worry." That's astonishing. What happened to these infants? By the way, it was not only females that were discarded, it was any deformed male child. Sometimes they were picked up by other people and raised, but that was the exception. The vast majority of them simply died. So infanticide is one major factor in the decline of the female population. But there's 2 more factors. One was the high mortality rate in the birth process. Female mortality was sometimes, in some periods in ancient history, reached 1 out of 4 women died in childbirth. So that's another factor. Another one was abortion. Abortion in antiquity was dangerous. Women died, and in fact, it was one of the leading causes of the death of women in the entire early Christian era. So you add infanticide, maternal mortality, and abortion, and you begin to understand why there is a shortage of females in Rome, hence why the population is declining. Now, why does that matter? Well, it produced some interesting results, one of which had an enormous impact on early Christianity. One was widespread Roman anxiety about it. In fact, it was so great that during the lifetime of Augustus, Caesar passed a law saying that any freeborn woman who bore 4 children that survived would be given legal independence. What that meant was you could own property, your husband died, you inherited all of the property. That was an enormous step forward for women's economic independence, and the law said, bear 4 children and it's yours. Moreover, he said, bear 3 children. For slave women, any slave woman who bears 4 children will be given freedom automatically. Now, when the government passes laws like that, you understand the anxiety level is rather high. So, all of this stuff is important for a couple of reasons. One reason is that scholars have discovered a phenomenon that would never have occurred to me. That is that in cultures in which there is a shortage of women, the restrictions placed on women are severe. In any culture in which there is a surplus or large number of women, the restrictions on women decline. That's a curious fact, but it turns out that it's pretty widely the case. So it turns out that's what was true in Sparta. In Athens, the female population was low, the restrictions on women were severe. There's no other word for it. In Sparta, there was an abundance of females. The result, far fewer restrictions on women. Why was there an abundance of females in Sparta and nowhere else in the Greek world? Because they did not practice infanticide. And more women survived, and hence the birth rate was higher, and hence the population of Sparta was not declining. And because so many Spartan men got killed in all the wars they got into, the fact was that the population of females in Sparta was greater than the population of males. That made it an exception in the Greek world, and one result of that was more freedom for women. So, Spartan women could own property, they could manage public affairs, they independently inherited. This one is very interesting. They could wear whatever they darn well pleased. And they could go anywhere they wanted. It did not require an escort. That was not true in any other Greek city we know of. So, this is starting to get very interesting to me. There's a second reason this is important. And that is because, unlike the entirety of the rest of the Roman world, in early Christian communities, there was a much larger number of women than men. That ought to begin to ring some bells. We're going to have to discuss why that was the case, but because it had the population pattern that was true in Sparta, it's also going to turn out that that was a factor in the greater freedom of women in the Christian communities than in the rest of the Roman world. Well, why was there a greater number of women in the Christian communities than in the Roman world? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One was they did not practice either infanticide or abortion. That meant that the gender ratio in that culture followed natural pattern rather than manipulated pattern that was true in the Greco-Roman world. The net result was that the birth rate in early Christian communities was significantly higher than in the Roman world. Moreover, because they did not practice abortion, women weren't done. Maybe I said abortion was one of the leading causes of female death in the ancient world. Christians didn't do that, hence the women weren't dying in the same numbers. Now, the second one is also equally interesting to me. It was true in early Christianity, it is true in Christianity today, and it's true in almost all religious communities in the world that there are greater numbers of women than men. That is true. That's true today. It's true in Westminster Presbyterian Church. It's true in every church in America. And it's true in churches today all over the world, and not only in Christian communities, but in Jewish communities, in Hindu communities, Buddhist communities. There are larger numbers of women than there are men. And that starts to get interesting too, because I wanted to think about the reasons why that occurred in early Christianity and why it occurs today. Well, let's start with the fact that because the population in Christian communities of women was far higher than the population of men, you had the same thing at work that you had in Sparta. The numbers dominance of women created different practices in regard to the freedom of women. So, it's true that in early Christianity, women frequently held leadership positions. I'm going to show you more evidence of that in a minute. They were frequently leaders. And most of that for most of Christian history, nobody ever heard of it. I never did growing up. I don't know about you. I'm going to have a little more to say about that in a minute. Now, it turns out that one of the factors that created more women in early Christianity was what sociologists call a primary rather than secondary conversion. But what do we mean by that? Primary conversion means you hear Paul preaching, you change your views, you convert to Christianity. It's a direct thing between you and the message that you have heard. That we call primary conversion. But let's say your husband doesn't go to church. It ain't too long before you're dragging him there. And over a period of time, when he's gotten drugged there often enough, he joins the group. That's what we mean by secondary conversion. It's true in all religious traditions that we know of. The primary conversion is prominent among women, and secondary conversion is prominent among men. Now, I will not ask any women to raise their hands here. But my guess is that some of you have dragged your partner along. The net result of which is that he eventually becomes part of the group. But because a primary conversion was common among women, we have to begin to look at the role women were playing in the spread of Christianity in the early Roman Empire. So, by the way, Paul actually mentions this. He says, I say to you, not the Lord, means my opinion. I didn't get this one from Jesus. This is just my opinion, he's telling me. If any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he shouldn't divorce her. A woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and consents to live with her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is consecrated through his wife. That's secondary conversion. The same can happen with the other gender, but it was far, far more common in the Roman world for women to be the ones who joined the community first. So, what that means is that where there were Christian families in their small house churches, it was women who were the primary instigators of getting the men to come and hence be part of the family together. Remember, they formed surrogate families. They called each other brothers. I gotta tell you about brother-sister language. Most Americans would say that emotionally, the closest relationship in our society is between husband and wife. That was not true in the ancient world. Were there no romances that worked that way in Rome? Yes, there were, but it was not the prominent pattern. Overwhelmingly, the closest emotional relationship in antiquity was brother and sister. Moreover, it was lifelong. That is, a brother considered himself the defender of his sister, even against her husband. Lifelong, that emotional relationship was the closest one in the Roman Empire. Now, when Christians called each other brother and sister, do you get the point? So, women are dragging their husbands to church. Now, there's one bit of evidence that women were especially prominent as the outreach folk, drawing people into the congregations. And in fact, that got to the point where it became of concern to the Roman government. Because if the population's declining, we don't have enough women, and now all of them are going off and joining that Christian community, what is happening to the birth rate in the Roman world? The panic level got to the point, folks, where in the year 370, Valentinian, the Roman emperor, a Roman empire who was emphatically not Christian, he actually issued an executive order forbidding Christian women to visit in the homes of non-Christian women. Because that's where primary conversions occur. What that tells you is that for all of the stuff we hear about Paul and people like him, he and men like him were not the primary conveyors of the Christian message in antiquity. It was women. Moreover, we have evidence of that. In the 16th chapter of Romans, Paul gives greetings to a whole lot of men and women who were fellow workers in the community. And one of the ones he lists is a woman named Junia. Junia is called distinguished among the apostles. Think about the word apostle. It's the Greek word apostello. It means to send out. So women were being sent out into the homes of other women. Right? Junia, he says, is distinguished among the apostles. And you never heard of that because English translations changed that feminine name to a masculine name. In English translations, that is changed from Junia to Junius. They couldn't quite imagine Paul calling a woman a distinguished apostle. Something's wrong. So they changed the name from Junia to Junius. So, all of this is this population stuff and the outreach. Well, we got more to say about outreach. Well, we'll do it in a minute. All of this is one factor in the result being larger numbers of women in the Christian community. But there were other factors. Another one that was probably even more important was what we call patronage. Patronage was a very, very big deal in the Roman world. What we mean by that is a wealthy, usually male, a wealthy man would have a whole following, so to speak, of people that he financed, supported financially, who did his bidding, and in return for which he provided the necessary support for them. Wealthy men, Roman men not only were patrons to individuals, but to groups, clubs, and even cities, and whole regions. Some of them were so rich. That patronage required that if you're the patron, you got to show up at my house every morning at 9 o'clock, and your toga better damn well be clean. And you had to publicly announce your, good morning to me on the streets every morning. And I will be waiting on the balcony at my house till you show up. That was a common pattern in the Roman world. And so these patrons bankrolled things right and left. And one of the things that created greater freedom for Roman women than Greek women was that in the Roman period, wealthy women began to act as patrons. And that gave them status in the community that they never had in the Greek world. There are no wealthy Greek women patrons. These women patrons, could bankroll enterprises of one kind or another, or people, or servants, or cities. And that gave them a greater role in public life than, at least for wealthy women, not ordinary folk. So, patronage, it turns out, was a significant phenomenon in early Christianity. What's happening here? And it turns out that most of the patrons we know about in early Christianity were women.
When you say Greek, do you really mean the Greek Orthodox Church versus the Roman Church?
No, I'm thinking prior to church, I'm just thinking society.
Okay.
Christianity spread most rapidly in the eastern end of the Roman world, not so much in the Latin world in the West. And that meant that most of the Christian population in the Roman world spoke Greek. They lived in the Greek cities of the Eastern Empire. And they were the dominant Christianity really through the first couple of centuries. Okay. Gradually it began to spread to the West. But in these cities, rich Roman women began to take on the role as patrons of house churches. That gave them an interesting kind of public role. And we know about some of them because they're named in the New Testament. Chloe is one. It says Paul talks in 1 Corinthians about Chloe's people. It's a clear tip-off. She's a patron. Okay? Lydia is one. Phoebe is a really important one. She's mentioned in the New Testament. We'll come back to her in a minute. There's just 3 examples of them, but there were others, and they're named in the New Testament. And there have to have been many, many that were not named. We know of them from other documents later that this phenomenon of women patrons bankrolling Christian congregations was widespread in early Christianity. That meant that these women were the leaders of those congregations. Never heard that one either, huh? Well, why is Phoebe important? She is important because Paul says she was the diaconon of the church of Cenchrea. Now, that word diaconon, we get the word deacon from that. But that's misleading. Because in Presbyterian churches, deacons are the second order of leadership. First order are the elders, right? Okay? But that was not true in the Roman world. That word diaconon referred to somebody who, on behalf of a senator or the Roman emperor, was his agent in control of an enterprise or a city. So Paul calls Phoebe that. It probably means that she was the leader of the church in Cenchrea. Maybe a better translation would be minister. She's their patron, she's bankrolling the operation. Then he calls her he says, Phoebe the prostasis. That's in terms even more important because it means patron. And he says, she is not only the patron of the church in Cenchrea, she is my patron. That suggests that Phoebe was bankrolling Paul. And who do you think called the shots? The fact is that not all, but many of the early Christian congregations were started by women patrons who reached out to other women first, who reached out to their husbands, dragged them to church, and eventually we have a congregation going, and you're paying all the bills. We know in the book of James that a lot of trouble was caused by that. I'll have more to say about that in just a second. So one factor that led to leadership of women in the early church was population. The second factor was patronage. But here is the most important point in my view. That is the fact that early Christian congregations were house churches. The house was the private sphere over against the public sphere. And in the house, who's the boss? In the Roman world, it was the woman. Miriam and I have actually seen that, living in the Middle East. The women play the dominant role in the house. Here's a Roman writer actually tells you that. This is in a document called, we don't know the writer, but he claims to be Aristotle, he wasn't. This is the province over which a woman should be minded to bear an orderly rule. So if we are in private space with large numbers of women, and we're bankrolled by women, who's going to be the leader in our group? In the home. Probably in the home of Phoebe. It's pretty obvious that women were playing that kind of role in early Christianity. So as long as Christianity was a house church religion, there is no doubt that women were leaders. In fact, we know women were bishops. Never heard that one, did you? Women were priests. Women were ordained. Women carried out ministerial duties, including baptism. Add this all together, and it's really not surprising at all that there was a very prominent female leadership in the early church. Much of which is covered up. We have to acknowledge, however, that it caused some controversy. And boy, do we have an interesting bit of evidence about that. You can expect there were a few men around who objected. In 1945, a treasure trove of ancient Christian literature was found at a place called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Among the things found was the Gospel of Thomas. Didn't Steve do a class on that? Yeah. One of the Gospels that was found there is called the Gospel of Mary, and the Mary referred to in the title is Mary Magdalene. Right? In that Gospel, there is a story about an interaction between the disciples and Mary Magdalene after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus is gone. And in the story, Mary Magdalene is up front. She is teaching the disciples. They were a little downcast, a little, discouraged, and she's trying to give them a pep talk. And in the process of that, she shares with them some of the things Jesus had told her. What was the reaction? Well, Andrew immediately jumps up and objects. I at least don't believe the Savior said this. Mary, I didn't put it in here, but Mary responds to Andrew, you think I'm lying about Jesus? Peter then jumps up and he says, did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Are we to turn about and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? We have other evidence as well that there was opposition to this. That kind of misogynistic reaction was sporadic for the first 2 centuries, but then it began to change. This is, I think, really important. During the first 2 centuries, Christianity is primarily a house church phenomenon. By the time we get to the 3rd century, more prominent males are part of the Christian community, and the church begins to shift toward the public arena. It will eventually get to the point where house churches disappear, and it is entirely a public institution, now recognized by Constantine as the religion of the empire. That transition destroyed feminine leadership in the church. Male leaders began to demand the same subjugation of women in the church that was the normal pattern in the patriarchal world or society of Rome. It actually turns, whereas we have this thing in the Gospel of Mary, 1 or 2 other objections early on, the objections now become an absolute avalanche. They're everywhere. Long discussions by early Christian writers about why women should sit down and shut up. They don't belong in leadership, because the church is now a public institution with a role in government. So things changed. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the demand arose that the church be organized exactly the way the society was. The bishops became governors of provinces. They sat on councils. They were advisors to the emperor. They were military leaders. Basically, the whole arena of the church shifted into the public, governmental, military world. So, leadership of women went underground. That was true until the middle of the 20th century. Were isolated places where feminine leadership existed in Christianity all through history. But it was largely suppressed. The information out of it about it disappeared. What did try to surface was suppressed. Women were ordained in the Presbyterian Church for the first time in 1958. That's the year I graduated from college. We were not, however, the first. Pentecostal churches were actually the first to ordain women. They go back as far as the early part of the 20th century. Even today, as I said, some denominations still refuse to ordain women. One of the ironies, but a tragic irony of that, is that these groups, like the Southern Baptists, think that what they are doing is going back to the pattern of early Christianity, which they assume was all male. And the irony is they've got it 180 degrees wrong. I can tell you that all of this that I've shared with you this morning was no part of my education. I never heard about it in college, never heard about it in a master's degree, never heard about it in my doctoral education. It's only been in the last 20, maybe 25 years that women New Testament scholars have begun to dig this stuff up. It's basically been lost to us since the 4th century. Now, I'm going to end this today by showing you that this patriarchal agenda is alive and well in American Christianity. Here's a verse from the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians. The King James Version says, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." I've explained this once years ago here, but For better or worse, that's about as accurate and word for word the translation of the Greek as you can get. King James got it right. There is a newer translation that's made it even a little bit clearer. It's called the Revised English Version. It says, this is why a woman should have a sign of her authority on her head. You can imagine from what I've told you that that would have made sense in early Christianity. However, here it is in the New Jerusalem Bible, so-called. It was originally a French Catholic translation. This is why it is right for a woman to wear on her head a sign of the authority over her. Because of the angels. That is not what the Greek says. Here it is in the Good News Bible, which is a Southern Baptist translation. On account of the angels, a woman should have a covering on her head to show she is under her husband's authority. That's a very popular translation in the evangelical world. There is no word for husband in the Greek original of that verse. Here it is in the Living Bible, very popular, it's called a paraphrase of the New Testament, very popular in the evangelical world. So a woman should wear a covering on her head as a sign that she is under man's authority, a fact for all the angels to notice and rejoice in. Sadly, I think patriarchal culture is still pressing us pretty hard. So that's my spiel for today.
Yeah,
We have time for questions.
tell about Denise Wagner.
Oh, she's asking me to tell about Denise Wagner, a young woman who was in the youth group in the church at St. Mark's. I was there. Has recently been ordained as a Catholic priest.
What?
Yes,
Very small.
there is a group of women in the Catholic Church who are ordaining women. As she calls them, the old men in red hats don't like it.
I would guess.
But it's delightful. Yeah.
Two things. First of all, does the Pope recognize this woman as an ordained
No,
priest?
he does not. There have been times when Pope Francis has kind of suggested he might lean that way, or did they come down on him first? Let me tell you how quickly. This is now 25 years ago. I was teaching a group of doctoral students, and in the class was the dean of the Roman Catholic operation at Mount Angel. He already had a PhD, but he was bored. So he was doing another one. And in the course of the class, they were writing papers on various topics. He wrote a paper advocating the ordination of women. And he decided to publish it. And it was published as an editorial in the Oregonian. Within 2 weeks, he was fired. The guy, Benedict, was the.
Yeah.
He wouldn't tolerate it.
He was one of my professors in Germany.
Pardon?
He was one of my professors in Germany.
Was he really?
I'm sorry.
So, yeah.
No, he was a liberal then.
No.
He had a conversion. Literally.
Yes.
So, in terms of these, shall we say, recent translation of the Living Bible and Southern Baptist, where did they get that? Where did they get that? What's the word? They found something under some rock, or biblical text.
It would be, I understand your question, and it's important. Where do they get that stuff? You can understand that translation is not merely a matter of replacing this word with the one in the other language. Inevitably, translation is interpretation. You can't avoid it, at least in some measure, because there are words that exist in Greek that are in the New Testament. We have no English equivalent. So you have to adjust. Now, if you think that translators of the Bible are saints with no agenda, you are naive. We all have agendas. It's inevitable. Moreover, translators have a problem. As you bring something from another culture into another language, think about the miscommunication that occurs across cultures. If it occurs verbally, why wouldn't it occur in writing? And so translators always have the task of worrying over whether they are accurately representing the concept, even though we have to figure out how to do it in a different culture. One of the things that means is that our biases tend to creep in. That's just simply one example. I could show you hundreds. I could show you where Americans translate things differently than Brits. We translate them different than the Germans. We translate them different than the Spanish. Would it shock you to know that English translations are the only ones that use the word homosexual? The only ones.
Dick, we have a question online from David Groff. David, you want to?
Yeah, you've said that the early Christians did not practice infanticide or abortion. I've read that they not only didn't do it themselves, they actually went out and campaigned against infanticide, saving children that were exposed. Do they also do that against abortion?
I can't hear.
He was asking if the early Christians acted against abortion, if they were tolerant in other ways, but what was the policy about abortion?
Well, he is asking what was the early Christian policy against abortion. They did not practice abortion. Most of the time their objection is because it's killing women.
Killing women.
Yes. Where?
Hitler's Germany.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
In today's organized religions, a lot of them are losing their patronage. How much can you compare what you just taught us today as the reasons why a lot of churches are losing their patronage? Is this a big reason that women are not respected in the church as well as men are, whereas the evangelical churches seem to be on the opposite end of that men are respected more than women, but yet they're more popular?
I don't know. He is asking whether respect for women in the community is having an impact on the churches losing or gaining members. I don't know the answer to that. That would take some serious work trying to figure that out. It's true that in the evangelical world there is a divide. The Pentecostal part of the evangelical world has no difficulty at all with women pastors. They've had them for a long time. But the Southern Baptists, as I said, the Missouri Synod, are strictly male leadership. So there's a kind of divide in the evangelical world. Most of what we call the mainline Protestant denominations, including Presbyterians, are ordained women. We're a little late to the party, but we got there. I don't know the answer. This has got to be the last question, folks.
There are Presbyterian denominations that do not allow women to be ordained or participate in authority.
That is true. He has said that there are Presbyterian denominations that do not allow the ordination of women. That is correct.
Not just the ordination, but in one case, a woman can teach a Sunday school class. So if a man joins the class, he becomes a teacher.
Yes. One of those is the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. They were split off our group in 1936. Another one is the so-called Presbyterian Church in America. That was a split off our denomination 10 years ago.
Yeah.
More than that now, but.
More than that. I grew up in what was called the United Presbyterian Church. That was a more conservative half of Presbyterianism in the country. They finally made the change, as I said, in 1958. In Scotland, where Miriam and I spent much of a year in Western Scotland, the Free Kirk, as they call it, is the conservative Presbyterian Church of Scotland. No women leadership of any kind. Church of Scotland, not a problem. So yes, there are Presbyterian churches where it does not exist. Folks, we're out of time with that.
Thanks so much, Jeff.